Hi, my name is Ale, and in this video I will be showing you how to implement an expandable button using SwiftUI. We're going to build an expandable button like this one, where you'll be able to tap on the primary button and it will reveal two more secondary buttons. In a previous video, I showed you how to implement a floating action button, but in that case you could only add a single button that could execute a single action. In this video, I will show you how you can implement a button that you can tap, which will reveal two or more buttons that can each execute a different action. We're going to start by defining a structure that will represent each of the buttons in our panel. This structure is going to be called Expandable Button Item. Each item will be identifiable. To achieve this, we're going to provide an ID and each item will also have an image, which we'll call label, as well as an action that will be executed whenever the button is tapped. So we can write var action, which will be a function that takes no parameters and also returns no value. This function will be optional and it will start out as new. Now that we have a structure to represent each of the buttons in the panel, we're going to define another structure for the actual panel. Struct expandable button panel. This will be a view. Let's first add the body of our panel. And for now, we can just add some text before we actually start writing all the code. So let's first define some of the properties that our panel will need. First, we will need one primary button, which will be of type expandable button item. Then we're gonna need a list of expandable button items to represent the secondary buttons. Now we're gonna define some properties that will be related to the interface of our panel, like the size and the corner radius, which is used to get rounded corners on the panel. So first I'm gonna define the size and I'm just gonna use 65. So private let size, which is of type cgFloat, equal to 65. We're gonna define the corner radius as a computed property, which will depend on the size. So the corner radius will be of type cgFloat as well, and it will have a value of size divided by 2. Now we're going to add one more property, which will be a state variable to define whether our panel is expanded or compressed. And this can be done by writing at state private var is expanded, and this will initially be false. Now that we have the necessary properties for our panel, we're going to start working on the interface. We're going to include each of the buttons in a vertical stack. So let's get rid of this text and add a vertical stack, which is just a VStack in SwiftUI. And let's first work on adding the secondary buttons. So the secondary buttons should only be visible when the panel is expanded. To achieve this, we can just add a conditional statement to check whether the value of is expanded is true. And if so, then we can add the secondary buttons to our UI. So if is expanded, so if our panel is expanded, for each of our secondary buttons, we're going to add a button object. For the action, what we can do is just call the action parameter in our item. So we can do that by writing button dot action, opening and closing parentheses. And since the action is optional, we need to type a question mark as well. And now for the label, all we need to do is provide the button's label property. So button dot label. Let's also give our button a size. We can do that by using the frame modifier, and we'll add that below our button dot frame. The width, we can use self dot size, which is the property we defined earlier, and we'll also use the same value for the height, self dot size. Great. Now let's add the primary button to our vertical stack. So the primary button will always be visible, so it doesn't have to be inside this conditional statement. So we'll add it just below that. And we're gonna add a button where the action, this will just be the primary button's action. So primary self dot primary button dot action. And since it's optional, we'll use the question mark. And then for the label, we need to provide the primary button's label. So self dot primary button dot label. Let's give our button a size, which will be the same as the secondary buttons. And finally, we're going to add some properties to our vertical stack, just to give some styling to our panel, like a color and a shadow and the corner radius. So under the vertical stack, we're first going to add the background, which will be the color dot white. Now we're going to add the corner radius to be able to get the rounded corners dot corner radius, and this will just be the corner radius value that we defined earlier. And finally, we're going to add a shadow with a radius of 5. Now that we've defined our expandable button panel, let's go back to the main view of our app and do some modifications. So for the sake of this demo, I'm going to add a list on the app, and that will be embedded inside a navigation view. So let's get rid of the text and add a navigation view. Inside our navigation view, I'm first going to add a Z stack. And before using the panel, I'm going to add the list, and this will just be a list of numbers. Whatever range you want to use is okay. And for each number in this range, I'm just going to add a row that will be of type text. Now let's also add a title to our navigation bar. We can do that just below our C stack. So we can use the navigation bar title modifier. And here I'm just going to write demo. So now let's actually add the expandable button panel. To be able to move the panel to the bottom right corner of the app, we're going to use two different stacks, a vertical one and a horizontal one. So below our list, let's first add the vertical stack using vstack. And first, inside the vstack, we're going to add a spacer that will move whatever is after the spacer to the bottom. And now we can add our horizontal stack. We'll also add a spacer here. And now let's add the expandable button panel. Expandable button panel. So the panel needs two parameters. First, it needs the primary item and then the secondary item. So let's define the primary button. This is of type expandable button item. And for the label, I'm going to use an image with the system name ellipsis. For the secondary buttons, we need to provide a list of expandable button items. So we can start by copying and pasting the primary button, which we will then modify a little for the secondary buttons. For the first button item, I'm going to use the system image called photo. And for the second one, I'm going to use the camera. Great. So let's go ahead and try to run our app and see how it looks. Okay, so as you can see, we have our list of numbers and we have our button. And if we tap it, let's see what happens. So as you can see, if you tap on this button, nothing is happening. Our panel isn't expanding. And that's because we didn't actually change the value of the isExpanded variable. So this is always false and our secondary buttons are never being added to the view. So let's go ahead and modify that. And let's also add some spacing around our panel so that it's not directly on the right edge of the phone. So let's go ahead and add some padding to our panel. And now let's modify the action for the primary button. So besides calling whatever action is provided in the item, we also want to be able to expand the panel. We will do that by toggling the value of isExpanded. And if we want to do that with a simple animation, we can just embed this call to toggle inside a with animation block. And this will expand and compress the panel with a slight animation. Now let's also add some actions to our secondary items so that they're executed whenever these items are tapped. What I'm going to do is show an alert whenever one of these secondary items is tapped. So let's add a state variable that will define whether the alert is shown. We can call this show alert, and it will initially be false. Now for each of these expandable button items, we're going to add an action that will consist of toggling the value of show alert. self.showalert.toggle. And now let's actually define the alert. We can do this just below our vstack using the alert modifier. For the isPresented parameter, we pass showAlert as a binding using the $sign. And for the content, we just need to provide an alert. So let's add here alert with a title, which is a text, and I'm just going to add a string that says tap. So let's go ahead and run our app again. Okay, so now we see our button with some padding around it, and if we tap it, we see that it expanded. Now let's tap one of these secondary buttons. We see our alert. Let's tap the other one. We also see the alert. Great. So that's all I wanted to show you in this demo. I hope you enjoyed it and you learned something new. If you want to learn more about iOS development, make sure to subscribe to my channel, as I'll be posting more videos very soon. Thank you for watching.